Also, I know that like the last couple times y'all have had to watch recordings because I've been crazy out of town. So does anybody have any questions for me since I'm live today before we get started on anything? No questions? Okay. Well, so just heads up, your test is going to be next Wednesday, October 10th. So I know that like if you're following along with the book, you might have seen that we were kind of jumping around a little bit with the chapters that we covered at different times this week. But that's just because of which ones I had recordings for and whatnot. But those are all in section 2. So we're still on track for exam 2 next Wednesday. And then you're going to have an assignment that's going to be due next Monday, which I'll go over at the end of class today, just to kind of remind you about it. And so my plan is today to cover like sheep and goats. And then on Wednesday, we're going to talk about aquaculture. And then on Monday, I'm going to do a test review for you. And then Wednesday will be the exam. So if you have any questions or if you have any questions after I posted the exam 1 key about your grade or anything, feel free to email me because even when I'm traveling, I'm still checking my email pretty often. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Can everyone see that? Did that share okay?
Yes.
Okay. I always just like to double check because sometimes it doesn't. All right. So today we're going to be talking about sheep and goats. So I believe last class period you had the lecture on alternative mammalian livestock. So these will be just a little bit different, but kind of still similar. So sheep and goats are actually produced together in much of the world, particularly in the developing world. So a lot of times if you know someone or you raise sheep, you also have goats. Both of them can be used for a lot of different products. So meat, milk, fiber. So that would be obviously from the wool and hair and leather. Obviously the wool would be more of from the sheep, clearly. So in 2005, China was the largest producer of sheep and goat meat, followed by India and Australia. So the United States isn't really a huge producer of sheep and goat meat, which makes sense because if you think about it, that's not really something that we eat a whole lot of. Sometimes people do. I've seen it occasionally at restaurants, but we're just not as big on that meat as other countries are. So the top sheep and goat producing countries are, of course, China, like I just said, India, Australia, which actually kind of surprised me because Australia is actually usually kind of fairly similar to the U.S. in their kind of culture and what they like to do. But Australia is number 3, and then Pakistan and Iran. So they're kind of important. Sheep and goats are important in the Middle East. So we do have sheep and goat production in the U.S., even though we don't eat a whole lot of their meat. So the top sheep producing states are actually Texas, California, Wyoming, Colorado, and South Dakota. So pretty much all out west. There are sheep in other parts of the country, as you can see from this map. The little blue dots represent about 1,000 sheep and lambs for each blue dot. So you can see that they are in other parts of the country, but it's really sporadic. It's kind of like scattered. There are some in Virginia, like over towards the western part of the state. But if you see like where they're mostly concentrated, it's going to be kind of further out west in some of those bigger states. So sheep have been one of the major agricultural livestock species for a long time. So there are about 6.2 million head of sheep and over 60,000 sheep operations in the U.S. in 2005. And there are approximately 1.02 billion sheep in the world. And so those numbers are probably just a little bit dated, but probably still somewhere around there. Sheep meat, so that would be lamb and mutton, and we'll talk about the difference between those two words a little bit later, represents less than 5% of all the meat that's produced in the U.S. So like I said, sheep meat and goat meat is not really something that the U.S. is super fond of. Just because we're a lot bigger on like pork and poultry and cattle. So sheep production in the U.S. is unique among all sheep producing countries because the U.S. market emphasis is actually on, I think it should be switched. It's actually on wool rather than meat, I think is what that's supposed to say. Because meat is not really a huge deal. That may be right because we eat lamb. I'm not actually sure. I will check on that statement because I'm thinking I got that reversed. So the ruminants are in the order Artiodactyla. I'm not going to make you know that word. It just basically means that they're even-toed ungulates. And so if you think back to your first test, that term means any hoofed mammal, and that as even-toed ungulates because they have two kind of divisions of their hoof. So they were the first livestock species domesticated around 9000 BC in the Fertile Crescent area, so where everything else was domesticated. So don't get confused with the first animal that was domesticated. That was the dog. Sheep were the first livestock species that were actually domesticated. So make sure you know that difference. So the ancestor of the domestic sheep that we know today was the Asian mouflon. And so sheep reached the Indian subcontinent by 6500 BC. They were in Europe by 6000 BC and then Britain by 4000 BC. So I'm not going to ask you to remember those dates, but that just kind of shows you where they started and kind of like moved across the world. So some sheep terminology, I like to kind of give you some vocabulary terms with every species that we talk about just so that you're familiar with the words that are used. So ewe is an adult female sheep. Ram would be male. Lamb is, of course, a young sheep. That's one that people are typically familiar with. A wether is a castrated male sheep. And so always watch the spelling on that. It's not spelled wether like the side. It's just the W-E-T. So that is kind of a weird word, but that means castrated male sheep. Lambing is the process of giving birth in sheep, which is pretty self-explanatory since baby sheep are lambs. And then ovine is the adjective that refers to sheep. So like with cattle, you have bovine. With pigs, you have swine. Ovine is the one that refers to sheep. And it's kind of hard to remember because for me, I don't know, it's always the hardest one for me to remember that it's ovine because it's just kind of strange to me. Picture just shows you a little bit of their external anatomy. Again, I'm not going to like put up this picture and make you label all of it or anything. But it just kind of shows you the different parts of the sheep. Some of them are similar to what we saw with cattle. So this is kind of more just for you to look at if you specifically work with sheep and just want to learn more or ever get into an anatomy class or anything, then you can kind of refer to this slide. But I'm not really going to go through every single body part. So as far as sheep reproduction, they are seasonally polyestrous. So what does that term mean? I'm going to see if that stuck with you yet. Does anybody remember? A bunch of you got it in the exam, so somebody knows. Season.
That's multiple cycles in a season, right?
What is that? Yes, correct. Exactly. So they're seasonally polyestrous. That we talked about, like the horse. And so think back to at the time of year, we're kind of getting longer. So sheep are really short day breeders. So in the fall, lambs are born in the spring. So based on their gestation length, its natural cycle is to breed in the fall when the days are getting shorter. And then station length, their lambs will be born in the spring when it's getting warmer. Ideal because obviously they're outside. So polyestrous and short day breeders, and what that means. They have a gestation length of about 147 days. So it's a decent time period. It's a little bit longer than pigs, shorter than horses and cattle, but it's still pretty decent gestation length there. Their estrus cycle is about 17 days when they are cycling during that season, and they will ovulate about 20 hours after the onset of heat. So I know we talked about that in the cattle lecture and when to breed and kind of that AM/PM rule. And so it's kind of always good to know when the animals are going to come into heat so then you know when to breed them. So sheep will be about 20 hours after you first notice they're in heat. So their nutritional demands increase during late gestation because the fetus is growing at a very, very rapid rate. And that would be true for pretty much any species. During late gestation is when that fetus is going to really take off. So during late, kind of like the last maybe 1/3 of that 147 days, if you have sheep, you want to make sure that you are feeding them a little bit more to meet their nutritional demands during that time period. So as far as mating, you can use natural mating or AI, similar to the other species like pigs and cattle. So there are advantages and disadvantages of both of those, so it really just depends on your system, but you can do either one. So puberty is when a ewe reaches sexual maturity and comes into heat, or estrus. Estrus and heat are kind of the same thing. Estrus and heat are, I should say, for the first time. So most ewe lambs reach puberty around 5 to 12 months. So that's actually kind of a decent time period if it goes more out to the 12-month period. But so that's kind of a big range of when they would reach puberty, and a lot of things can go into why that range is so large. So the age of puberty can be determined by a lot of different factors. So breed, genetic selection, their body size, nutrition. If they're not being fed properly, they're not going to be putting on enough body weight to actually start cycling. And then the season of their birth actually affect that. So lots of different things. So if you have a sheep operation, it's good to take all of these into consideration to kind of be ready and know if your sheep are going to kind of maybe come into puberty at that 5-month mark, or if it's going to be at the 12-month mark. Always good to know. So there are a lot of different breeds of sheep. So there's the Border Leicester, I think is how that word is said. Cheviots, Dorsets, English Leicester, Finn sheep, Ile-de-France, and then Merino, Rambouillet, Scottish Blackface, Texel, and Welsh Mountain. And there are probably more than that. These are just kind of the ones that people typically talk about. So the breeds can kind of be divided out based on their wool quality. So you have what are called your fine wool breeds, which are going to be like the wool products that will be super, super expensive because it's such a fine wool. It's so soft. And so those would be your Merinos or your Ramboulets. So I don't know if you've ever like come across any like Merino socks or anything like that in the store. Either they are way more expensive than is socks that were made from other types of wool. And then there are medium wool breeds, which would be your Cheviots, your Dorsets, and your Finn sheep. So if you're thinking about having sheep, then you kind of need to decide what market you're going to target. And if you're going to target anything that's made with wool, it's always probably beneficial to get Merinos or Ramboulets because they definitely will be priced higher for those products. So when you're choosing a sheep breed, you want to think about purpose and use of that animal. What are you going to be breeding? What are you going to be breeding it for? What are you going to be using it for? Which market are you going to target? Meat, wool, or, just think about what you're going to do. So along with that, like I just said, would be the fiber or the coat type. So if you're crossbreeding, you could select a maternal and paternal line that could kind of give you different quality. But if you're kind of targeting like one specific quality, like wool fiber, you may not want to crossbreed. So just a lot of different things to kind of think about and consider if you were going to raise sheep. Does anybody have any sheep, by the way? I forgot to ask. No. They're kind of fun. They're interesting. I got to work with them a lot in school. And then my uncle has some, but not a whole lot of people really have sheep, I've found. So 50% of the world's population is actually the Merino sheep. So this is one of the fine wool breeds that I just talked about. They're known for their extremely fine wool, which is soft and a very high, and they can thrive in arid and semi-arid regions. And so they have a lot of good qualities in addition to their fine wool. They have a very strong flocking instinct. So if something is going on in their pasture, like if there's a predator or something like that, they will flock together to kind of be like a larger group for protection. They have a really big instinct that way. They're extremely productive. They're very adaptable to kind of different situations. They're excellent foragers, and they have a long lifespan. They're very long-lived compared to some other breeds. They're slightly smaller than sheep that are bred for meat, which if you think about it kind of makes sense because the sheep that have been bred for meat would probably have been bred for size over time because you want to get more meat from that animal. And so these are definitely going to be your sheep that are bred for wool. So Rambouillet are the most popular commercial sheep, and they are actually the foundation breed of most Western U.S. flocks. So they are a dual-purpose breed, and I'm pretty sure in the cattle lecture we talked about dual purpose and what that term means. And as you can see, it's bolded and underlined, so very good chance it's going to be on your test. So dual-purpose breed just means that it's used for more than one function, so two purposes. So basically used for meat and wool would be a dual purpose for sheep. So they are actually of a larger size. The Ramboulets are larger than the Merinos. They also have a really good flocking instinct and are long-lived as well. So Dorsets are the most popular white-faced breed. We'll talk about black-faced breeds a little bit later. And so Dorsets are very, very popular. I remember that's one that I learned a decent amount about in college. We kind of talked about Dorsets for a good while. And there are also polled Dorsets that are popular in the U.S. I'm not sure if I talked about that in the beef lecture or not, but polled just means that they don't have horns. That's actually determined genetically. That typically happens, and then they won't have horns. They have medium wool quality, so they're not quite as fine as the Rambouillet or the Merinos, but decent wool quality. They are very prolific breeders and milkers, so that means that they are really good at kind of maternal reproductive traits. Prolific would mean they would typically have a lot of lambs, and then they're really good milkers, which is extremely important if you want those lambs to grow. They also have good body carcass for meat production. As you can kind of see, if you look at the pictures, like if I flip back, you can kind of see that that's a bigger lamb, bigger sheep, but it's not quite as like stocky as this one is. You can kind of see just from how they stand and how they look that this one kind of looks a little bit more muscular than some of the breeds that are going to be bred for wool. So the Suffolk is a breed of sheep that has black legs and black head. So they would be a black-faced sheep breed, obviously. They're more popular as a meat sheep than a wool sheep. And they are usually used for mutton, which is meat from an adult sheep. So lamb means that it's meat from a baby, but not necessarily a baby as in like a tiny, tiny lamb. It's going to be anything less than 1 year old is still considered a lamb. So they could actually be decent sized and still be considered a lamb. Anything over 1 year old is going to be considered mutton. That meat from an animal that's that old is going to be mutton. It's not going to be as great of quality, so people don't typically like to eat a whole lot of mutton. Lamb is a lot better quality, but just be familiar with that term. I remember in school, actually, we had some lamb, we had like legs of sheep, and we actually, like, there's a joint that you can break, and if it breaks, that tells you that it was a lamb, and if it doesn't break, that it needs to be classified as mutton because the bones had actually fused together due to the age of the animal. So that was just kind of something that like stuck with me. But so that's kind of how people can distinguish sometimes if they're not quite sure of the age of the animal. So they have medium wool quality because, like I said, they're used primarily for meat. And they're very large and fast growing. And if you've never seen these sheep, I can definitely attest to the fact that they are quite large for sheep. In one of my labs in school, we had to like learn how to flip sheep so that we could trim their hooves. And I got the luck of the draw, and I had to go try to flip a Suffolk. And I took it down because I just spun it around and made it dizzy, I think. But they are really, really big. They're a little bit harder to handle than some other smaller breeds. And they have really good meat quality because, again, they're very, very large, and they're typically used for meat. Hampshires are another black leg and face breed. So they kind of look like the Suffolks a little bit, but they've got a lot more wool around their face, as you can see in that picture. So if you kind of compare, Suffolks aren't have any of that wool on their face. Their whole head is going to be just black and kind of like a lighter, shorter hair than this wool that's on the Hampshires. So they have a fine quality medium wool. So of the breeds that have medium wool, these are going to be pretty good, closer to the merinos, but not quite of that level. They grow rather quickly. They have really good meat quality. Like just looking at them again, you can kind of see that they look a little bit, as far as their body structure, kind of like Dorsets. They're pretty like stocky and well muscled. They're large size and probably not as large as the Suffolks, but they're still pretty big. And then they're active foragers, and they have a mild disposition. So that means that they would probably be pretty easy to handle. They may not charge you like some sheep that I've seen, because they're going to be a little bit calmer than some of your other breeds. So moving on to sheep nutrition. So sheep are ruminants, which I know we've talked about in the cattle lecture that you saw previously. So what can anybody tell me about the ruminant stomach? What classifies them as a ruminant? If you think back to the beef lecture, how are ruminants different from like monogastric animals or non-ruminants? Do they have like one simple stomach compartment, or what's going on there? Anybody remember? Does anybody remember from the lecture the 4 compartments of a ruminant stomach? Does anybody remember that? Think about that. Is that sounding familiar at all?
Yeah, I remember it.
Yeah. So ruminants have 4 compartments to their stomach. And so I'll kind of just review, since that I know the beef lecture was several lectures ago, so it's not fresh in your mind. So ruminants have 4 compartments. Again, they do not have 4 stomachs. That's kind of one thing that it's kind of conception. People tend to say they have 4 stomachs. That's not the case. They have 1 stomach with just 4 different sections. And so those compartments are the rumen is a really big one. So ruminants have a rumen, big difference. And then the reticulum, omasum, and the abomasum. So just to kind of review really quick, the rumen is going to be where when the forages and the feed come in, they're going to kind of like ruminate. You're going to have a lot of microbes there that are going to have they're going to do fermentation of all of that plant material, and produce volatile fatty acids. And from the rumen and the reticulum, the feed can actually kind of go back up. So the animals, if you ever see cattle or sheep kind of lying around doing that, that can happen. The reticulum is also kind of similar to the rumen, but it has more papillae in it for absorption. So it's not going to do as much of the fermentation with all of the microbes. So the reticulum is typically somewhere that a lot of producers can actually place like an animal magnets, and they'll settle down in the reticulum based on kind of the structure of the animal to kind of like nettle or anything that they eat in their pasture. But so the rumen kind of looks like the honeycomb structure. And then is it backwards? I'll have to go back to cattle lecture when we review. But the reticulum and the rumen kind of are a little bit similar. They kind of have a compartment that's a little bit open between them, so food can kind of slosh back and forth. And then the omasum is the compartment that has all the folds. That's more for liquid absorption. So in baby animals, the omasum is going to be really, really big and important. It has literally folds like a book. And then the abomasum is going to be like their true stomach. So basically the stomach that we would have as non-ruminants. Is that all kind of coming back to you now a little bit? We'll go over it again in the review before the test, but make sure that you're familiar with the parts of the ruminant stomach. And so maybe go back to that beef lecture and kind of look at those pictures and things like that, and be familiar with those. So sheep are ruminants, obviously, like I just talked about for 10 minutes. So they're similar to cattle in that respect. They require water, energy, protein, vitamins, minerals, and I have vitamins on there, again, because that's how important they are. So copper deficiency or toxicity can be a problem in sheep. There are low copper levels found in plant meat, and they can actually interact with other nutrients. The copper can interact with other nutrients. So the copper levels in the diet must be adequate but not excessive. And so this is very, very important to note, because sheep are very susceptible to copper deficiency, and they're also extremely susceptible to copper toxicity. So there can be not enough, but then there can very quickly be too much. So that's kind of one thing that you really have to consider with sheep, is the copper issue. So as far as managing your sheep herd, obviously, like you would with other livestock, flock vaccinations are going to be important for whatever disease is kind of prevalent or at different times of the year, or diseases that sheep are typically common to. So you'll want to always talk to a veterinarian about what vaccinations need to be, what your vaccination schedule needs to be. Internal parasite control is also a really big thing with sheep, because they're obviously out on pasture, so they're going to be taking in a lot of parasites. So deworming, having a good deworming schedule is very important. Shearing, have sheep that you're going to be used for wool especially, but even if you don't, shearing is still really, really important. I've seen animals before that were not sheared when they should have been, and it just starts getting really out of control. Bad things can start happening to their skin because they've just got so much wool and it catches all the dirt and everything in there. So shearing, a good shearing schedule with someone who knows how to shear properly is always really, really good thing to have. I say shear properly because there is a certain technique to it, so you can do it really fast with minimal stress to the animal. I actually in school saw a guy shear an entire sheep in like less than 30 seconds. It was crazy. So people can get really, really good at it. Lamb care is extremely important. And so lamb care involves things like tail docking and castration. So docking the tail would be obviously removing a good portion of the tail, and I'll explain why in a second. And then castration also would typically happen at lamb care. If it's not an animal that you're going to keep around as a ram to breed, then you want to go ahead and castrate it. So tail docking is extremely important because matter on the tail if lambs have a longer tail, which actually, if you've never really been around sheep, you wouldn't think about it, because sheep that we see, adult sheep, have a shorter tail, but they're actually born with a much longer tail. And that fecal matter that gets on that tail when they're younger will actually attract flies. And then you have a situation that's called fly strike, which is where flies have been attracted to that site and they have kind of laid eggs, and then you get maggots in the wool. And so that can be a very, very bad situation. That animal will eventually become very lame on their back end. And most of the time, any animal I've seen that's had it has not made it by the time it's noticed. So if it's noticed really early, it can possibly be treated, but it's a really, really nasty situation. And so to avoid that, it's just much easier to dock the tail. And that will really help prevent the majority of those cases, because trust me, it is disgusting and it's horrible for the animal. So there are different tools that you can use to dock the tail. One that I just put on the slide to kind of show you that's kind of a more popular method is the elastrator. And so that uses these little elastrator bands that are basically like really intense rubber bands. And so basically all you do is you kind of open it, and then you, like it is in the picture, you place it where you want it on the tail, and then you just kind of pull the machine out, and then the rubber band will be in place. And so what this does is it slowly over time constricts the blood vessels of the tail, or the scrotum area if you're using it for castration, which you can. And eventually it will, all of that will, the blood vessels will just completely constrict until the tail is no longer getting any blood flow, and it will fall off. A lot of people method because it kind of seems cleaner. It's overtime, and it seems like it's probably less painful. And it just, from an animal welfare standpoint, kind of seems like a cleaner method. Other methods would be like an emasculatome, where you kind of just clamp down really, really hard, and then you kind of dock the tail that way. And then there are some tools that actually will kind of cauterize the tail and burn it off. So lots of different methods, but I would say from human animal welfare perspective, people typically like the elastrator band better. But it just depends on what system you have and what tool you prefer to use. Some people want to just cauterize the tail and be done, and then they don't have to wait for it to fall off. So just really depends. Hoof care is something that cannot be talked about enough with sheep, especially. So hoof disease prevention is a really, really big thing for sheep and goats. And so sorry that it's before your lunch and I have these gross pictures up there. But foot rot is a really, really bad situation that can happen with sheep or goats. And it's an infection that's caused by bacteria. And it's common in like wet, muddy, warm areas that have poor sanitation, which makes sense because if you think about how bacteria like to grow, any place that's wet and warm and just not really well cleaned is going to be a breeding ground for bacteria. So foot rot is one of the worst diseases in the sheep industry. So most people, when they think of a disease, they think of like respiratory disease or some kind of virus or something like that. And so with sheep, it's actually a disease, a bacteria that can affect their hooves that's just completely devastating. So you can prevent foot rot with vaccinations, good sanitation practices, and always quarantining new animals. So if you're getting in new animals that are from an area that you're not so sure like what their vaccination schedule was or what kind of area that animal was kept in, you always want to make sure that you quarantine new animals for a decent period of time until you can kind of assess if they're bringing any sort of disease or anything like that into your area. Because if you get an animal that has the bacteria that's causing foot rot and then it's your other animals, it's kind of a matter of time if you don't have all the sanitation steps in place. So other things you can do other than vaccinations, if you've ever been on a sheep farm, you'll see that they have foot baths. So it's literally kind of just like a giant area where you can kind of get all the sheep in there, and it's got a foot bath that's, typically no more than like this deep. And that will be like water that's been kind of treated with chemicals to clean their hooves. And so a lot of farms that have a lot of muddy areas will run their sheep through there kind of on a schedule to clean their feet, and then they'll leave them in there for a little bit, and then they'll let them out. So it's just kind of something that they have as a routine care kind of thing for their sheep. And then hoof trimming is also very important. Sheep's hooves will start to grow and get kind of out of control. So that's something that you need to watch. It's really easy to trim their hooves. It's not a big deal. You can literally like set them up on their butt, and then they kind of just not go limp, but they no longer care what you're doing to them. If you just set them up, they'll let you do whatever. So that's flip sheep, flipping them up on their behind, and then you can just trim their hooves. And if you get really good at it, you could do a sheep in like probably 30 seconds if you're really good at it. It'll take a little while, but it's really easy. So that's something that's really good to manage, because as you can see on the bottom right, that would be a hoof that hasn't been trimmed properly, that's overgrown, and the shape and everything is getting all messed up. And if an animal's feet start going, it's more time before that animal goes down. So hoof care is extremely important for a lot of animals, but sheep and goats especially. Because if you think about it, I remember in my intro class, our professor told us, always remember, sheep are born looking for a way to die. So apparently they're a pretty hard livestock species to raise. So sheep that are used for meat can be marketed directly to a packer or a small processor through terminal markets, or by just direct sales to the public, which would include other sheep that are older than 2 years would be called, sheep would be if the animal is in 2 years. A yearling would be 1 to 2 years old. It kind of just turned a year. And then a lamb, like I said, would be less than 1 year old. So carcasses are graded according to USDA standards from top to bottom as choice, good, and utility. So that's just how they grade the meat. So like if you think they do the same thing with like a prime rib, DA choice, if you're, that's just where category. I'm being the best. It's going to end up in like pet food or something. That's not going to be meat that you're going to see on the shelves in the.
Leanne, your internet's been being a little bit quirky and you're breaking up a little bit now, just for the warning, just so you know.
Okay. Yeah, I did get a little warning like a little while ago that said it was like unstable, but I'm not sure why, because it's saying I have like 5 bars and I'm right next to the router, but hope.
And you completely froze.
Oh no.
Are you there?
Yes. Am I still frozen?
No, now you're unfrozen, but you're still jumping around a little bit. Your connection to your Wi-Fi may be strong, but it's the connection your Wi-Fi router has to the internet is where the problem is.
Okay. Gotcha.
Unless your husband's in the next room downloading 4K movies and watching them. And
no, it's just me, but I did have a couple of other devices on it, so I just took those off. I forgot to do that before I started. So hopefully nothing else is using it now. Is that better, or am I still jumping?
Yeah, that seems to be better, but you probably need to start back with the USDA grading.
Okay.
We really started losing you then.
Okay. So just in case, just to review really quick, a sheep would be greater than 2 years old, a yearling would be 1 to 2 years old, and then a lamb, like I said earlier, would be less than 1 year old. So carcasses are graded according to USDA standards from the top standard to the bottom as prime, choice, good, and utility. So the same way that beef are graded, so, you know, in the store, you think about like beef, like USDA prime or USDA choice. And so those are going to be the same for sheep meat. And so then when you get into the good and utility categories, that's going to kind of be the meat that's going to end up in like dog food or pet food in general. You're never going to see any utility meat actually reach the grocery store. It's going to be USDA prime and USDA choice. And there are a lot of things that go into those grading standards. So they take into account the age of the animal, the amount of marbling or intramuscular fat that's in that particular piece of meat. And so lots of different things into that.
We'll actually be
so another big problem.
I was just saying we'll actually be talking about that in my marketing class either Wednesday or next Monday. So stay tuned for those of you there. Good.
Yeah, that's always really interesting. When I remember learning like everything that goes into that, and it's pretty intense. So another big issue with sheep is predators. So more than 250,000 sheep and lambs are killed every year by predators. Coyotes typically kill about 60%, so they're kind of the big predator that you typically think of, especially if you remember that a lot of the sheep production is happening out west. You can imagine that they have quite a lot of predators. Domestic dogs actually are responsible for about 15% of deaths in sheep. And then large cats, of course, like mountain lions and pumas, etc., are responsible for about 6%. So if you have sheep, you need to think about methods to protect the sheep. So guard dogs, donkeys, llamas are good options. Fencing to exclude predators is always something good, which you'll probably have fencing in place anyway to keep the sheep in, unless you're on like a massive farm out west or something. But really fencing is only going to do so much to keep out a predator. I mean, a coyote's not going to get to the fence and then care and turn around. Killing or trapping the predators is also an option, but that could kind of be an exhaustive hobby because you kill one, more are just going to come back. So typically guard dogs, donkeys, and llamas are probably your best bet in addition to fencing and other things like that. So a little bit about their wool and milk. Wool is hair or fur of sheep and goats. And so with goats, it's not going to be really that kind of wool. It's going to be more hair, obviously. And it's predominantly composed of the protein keratin. So that's just the name of the protein that really makes up their hair or wool. The wool or fleece is removed by shearing, like I talked about earlier. Merino sheep produce the best wool. I think I've drilled that in pretty well. Sheep's milk can be used extensively worldwide for specific high-value cheeses. So I don't think sheep's milk is used for cheese a whole lot in the U.S. I know goat milk is, but I typically hear of goat milk more than sheep for sure. So transgenic sheep is something that we're going to talk about next. So this was actually a test question for you. So if you missed it, pay attention now because you'll probably see it again. So a transgenic animal is one in which the gene of another organism has been inserted into its genetic material. So it's not the same thing as like a hybrid or hybrid vigor. They're very different terms. Transgenic animal has kind of transgenic, the word has gene kind of in there, genic. So it means a gene has been taken from another organism and inserted into the genome of this animal. So it's bolded and underlined. Be familiar with that term. So in the late 1980s, transgenic sheep were produced by injection of the pronucleus of the ovum with specific DNA. And so basically just what that means is that in the 80s, transgenic sheep were from animal and putting it into the cell and of the sheep that they were trying to actually make. So the technology of sheep cloning from cells by nuclear transfer into an ovum, which just means egg, was demonstrated with Dolly in Scotland in 1996. So this is important because this was actually the first time that a mammal was cloned from adult cells. So not from like cells that are going to actually start producing like a fetus. First mammal cloned from another adult animal. So mammal ever cloned. And I remember in my intro class, they always made a really big deal about that. So sheep judging, along with other livestock judging, obviously, there's a lot of different livestock judging areas. Sheep is one of them. So you can have it at the collegiate level, state judging contest. I actually have a friend whose kids show goats. So goats and sheep judging is kind of a big thing. Livestock judging can build confidence and improve communication skills, especially with smaller children. And you must be able to evaluate all different aspects of the animal. So we talked about sheep primarily. So now I'm just going to touch on goats for a little bit. They're relatively uncommon in the U.S. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say completely uncommon, like you do see goats around. But compared to other livestock species, you definitely don't see them as much. They have a population of about 2 million in the U.S. Worldwide, there are over 500 million goats, and then the highest numbers would be in Asia, like we talked about, particularly like China and India, and then Africa as well. Goats can provide milk, meat, leather, and cashmere and Angora wool. So goats were domesticated in the Fertile Crescent. Surprise, surprise. That's where everything was domesticated. So still kind of have that term in your head. And the ancestor of the domestic goat is the Bezoar goat. Again, I'm not going to ask you to know like any of those really hard words that are like Latin or something because they're really hard to remember and I don't think you need to really worry about them. Goats are seasonally polyestrous, just like sheep are. They're also short day breeders, exactly like sheep. They breed in the fall so that their kids are born in the spring. And kids is actually the scientific term for what goat babies are called. And they have a gestation of about 150 days, so just 3 days longer than sheep. So they're very, very similar in a lot of ways. Breeds of goats include Angora, American Cashmere, Border Leicester, the pygmy goat, which I used to have one when I interned at a zoo, and they're super adorable. And then the Thuringian and Toggenburg. Just to kind of go through a few of these, I'm not going to hit on all of them, but some of them that are kind of a little bit more common that you might see. Nubians are good for milk. Their milk has a high butterfat content, and they can actually produce milk all year round. They have the classic long floppy ears, as you can see in this picture, and they're actually really tall. Nubians are really, really tall goats. They're not as short as some of the other breeds. They're usually brown, but they may have like kind of some other markings on them, like brown and black are kind of typically the colors you see on them with a little white on the head. They're the largest of the dairy goats. Like I said, they are pretty tall. They're decent sized animals. Because they weigh more, they can also be used for meat, but their meat is probably not that great of a quality. Boar goats is actually what my friend raises that her kids actually show. They actually just won a thing in Pennsylvania with one of the goats that she raised. They won a competition. So boar goats are a popular breed for meat production. And you can see just from looking at it that they're very kind of heavy muscled. You can kind of just tell how like stout they are and how they stand. So males can grow up to 300 pounds. They're not as tall as the Nubians, but they're definitely, they can get extremely heavy because they are so muscular. They are pretty resistant to disease, so they'd be animals that would be pretty easy to raise, and they reproduce often. So just a little bit about the goat digestive system, which again is going to be much like the sheep, pretty much exactly the same. You have the esophagus, which connects the mouth to the stomach. And so then you have this really, really large rumen, which we just talked about, which is where fermentation is going to happen. And then you have the reticulum. And then the abomasum, which is their true stomach. So that's going to be where chemical digestion is going to take place. Then you have the small intestine and then the large intestine as well. So that's exactly what a sheep's would look like. So as far as goat nutrition, much like sheep, like I just said, they're ruminants. So they require the same classes of nutrients: water, energy, protein, vitamins, minerals. They do require a higher quality diet than cattle. And this is mainly because their digestive tract is smaller than cattle, obviously, because they're a smaller animal, but smaller with regard to their energy needs. So it's not just that it's smaller, it's that it's a lot smaller kind of in respect to how much energy they actually need to consume. So they need, roughages and hay and things like that that are of better quality than cattle. So typical diets for goats contain copper. And so this is a really big deal because you cannot feed goat diets to sheep. And this could be extremely like a problem because a lot of people, especially that I've seen in North Carolina, have goats and sheep together. And if you're getting like a bagged feed that's specifically for goats from the store, it has copper nutritional requirements. And sheep need it too, but if you remember back to earlier, I said sheep are extremely susceptible to copper toxicity. So if you feed a goat diet to a sheep, you're probably going to kill that sheep. So just something to be aware of if you are going to kind of have them in the same area. Because they're similar animals, I've seen people make that mistake quite a lot where they think they can just go and feed a goat feed to a sheep, and it's not going to be good. So always make sure that you're feeding the proper feed to whatever animal you have. So goats can be used for liquid milk that's sold through distributors to consumers or made into cheese. Like I mentioned earlier, goat cheese. I really like it. A lot of people don't really care for it. They say they can like taste that it's from a goat. But goat cheese is kind of pretty popular, I feel like. Two very valuable products from two specific breeds would be mohair, which is made from hair of Angora goats. And so that gives clothing like a silky feel, kind of a silky look. And then cashmere, I'm sure some of you have heard of cashmere sweaters and things like that. That's wool or hair from the cashmere goat. So it's very fine fiber that can be used for like really nice clothing like sweaters, socks, coats, shawls, whatever, what have you. And it is going to be rather expensive. Other goat products would be meat. Like I said, it's not huge in the U.S., although there is a demand for goat meat in the U.S. It's still not really all that popular, I would say. Goat leather is also another significant product. Pharmaceutical proteins are another use of goats. So transgenic goats can be used to produce a certain enzyme that can actually protect the human body against nerve gas. So that's just kind of something cool that they've done scientifically, to actually insert a gene into a goat's genome, and then they can produce this enzyme that could then be used to treat a person that's been exposed to a nerve gas. So just kind of something interesting there. So that's the end of my sheep and goat lecture. Does anybody have any questions on anything? Everybody ready to start a sheep farm now? Okay. So next I'm going to show you the assignment. So go on to Blackboard and just go in assignments and scroll down. I just made this available this morning, so you should be able to see it now. So this is the assignment I would like you to do by next Monday. So this assignment is actually going to be worth 20 points instead of your typical 10 points because it is a little bit lengthier, but it still shouldn't take you too long. So what I want you to do is just choose a livestock species that we've talked about in class. So like either cattle, you can do dairy or beef, pigs, sheep, goats, or poultry, any of them that we've covered. And I don't think I actually have chickens listed on there, but you can totally do chickens because we talked about that. And answer the following questions. And I want you to answer it as if you're thinking about kind of becoming a livestock producer. So make sure that you completely answer the questions because some of the questions have kind of two parts to them. So a mistake I saw last year was people kind of read the first half of the question and answered it, and then they lost points because they didn't fully answer it. So really all I want you to do, you can use your lecture notes, you can use additional resources online, book, whatever, is I just want you to answer these questions. So choose a species. What is the end product you're going to get from this species? So are you going to go for meat, wool, eggs? What's the goal? Which breeds you will use, and then why did you choose those breeds? So I want you to tell me what are the advantages and the disadvantages of the particular breed that you chose. Tell me if your species is ruminant or non-ruminant, and then what type of feeds will you feed your animals based on that classification. Are there any specific nutritional requirements for this species? So like, for example, if you chose goats, copper would be a specific requirement. There may not be any specific requirements, but that's something you need to go back to the lecture notes and find out. Will you use natural mating or artificial insemination for breeding and why? So I want you to kind of talk about the advantages versus disadvantages of both of them and why you chose one over the other. And then does the species breed during a certain season or can you breed it any time of year? When is the best time to breed an animal, whatever animal you choose once you're showing signs of heat? And that would kind of probably apply more to like your cattle and your sheep and horses more than it would to like poultry. So just kind of, if that doesn't directly apply to your species, just kind of answer it as best you can, and explain, why you didn't, need to answer that question for that species. How long is the gestational period for this species? And on average, how many offspring will they have? Are there any health or disease concerns with the species? If so, what are they? So like, what are the major diseases that can affect them? So like example, sheep, we just went over, foot rot would be a big one. What other management tools or techniques would be helpful when producing this livestock species? So for example, record keeping, fencing, do you need a guard dog? Things like that. So you should be able to answer all of these from the information in the PowerPoints that I've given you. But again, if you want to go online and you want to do kind of more extensive research, or kind of draw off of your, own experiences, if you have a farm, feel free to put that in there. But just kind of view this as you're going to become a livestock producer, and how you would kind of set this up and these questions that you would think about. So it's going to be worth 20 points, like I said. Read the questions fully. And you can see the breakdown of the points on the questions. And I have this set to be due next Monday by like 11:59 p.m. So you still have all day Monday. But I wouldn't recommend waiting until the last minute. Does anybody have any questions on this assignment?
My question, do you want them to stick with beef, pigs, sheep, goats, chickens? Or is it okay if they went into the fish and rabbits and that kind of stuff that since we bounced around last week? You've already covered them.
Yeah, they could if they wanted to. I feel like the only thing on those is that there's not quite as much information to be able to answer all of the questions. So you could, but it would probably require more online researching, I guess is what I'm because I know for like cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats and poultry, I know that I covered all of this information, but for some of the other ones, I don't think I've fully answered all of the questions. So you may have to go to outside resources, but if someone really wants to do one of those, then I have no problem with
Okay, I just wanted them to know that.
Yep. Yeah, if you want to. I just know I've given you kind of more information on kind of the bigger livestock species. Okay, well, if no one has any questions, then I'm done for today. And then on Wednesday, we will talk about aquaculture. Y'all have a good day.
Okay. Bye, everybody.